Good evening, everybody. I'm Alicia Sams. I'm the director of the Pritzker Fellows Program here at the Institute of Politics, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to this important discussion with our newly arrived fellow, Lotfullah Najafizada, the esteemed New York Times journalist David Sanger, and a man who needs no introduction, but who will be introduced shortly. Before one of our students formally introduce our guests, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping and some upcoming events. On Friday, October 29th, Congressman Adam Schiff of California and Senator Tammy Duckworth will join us to talk about the peril facing American democracy and the latest from Capitol Hill and the January 6th investigations. On Tuesday, November 2nd, our current IOP Pritzker Fellow and former New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu and Faiz Shakir, political advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders and his campaign manager in 2020, will join us for a friendly debate about the direction of the Democratic Party. After that, we'll be having an election night watch party to watch the returns from across the country. We also hope that you students will join us throughout the week for our insightful off-the-record seminars with the rest of our Pritzker Fellows at the IOP, and you can sign up for all of those over there. After the moderated discussion, we will open the floor to take questions from all of you in the audience. Please line up to ask your question, and remember, everyone is welcome at the microphone, but please keep your mask on when you ask your question, and also remember that a question ends with a question mark. As usual, we give priority for the first questions to be asked by our students. Also, please take this moment to put your phones on silent. And we will now have our formal introductions of our speakers from Astrid Weinberg. Astrid is from New York City. She's a second-year student in the college studying political science and history and is working this quarter as a Fellows Ambassador for Lotfullah. So please join me in welcoming Astrid to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Lotfullah Najafizada and David Sanger. Lotfullah is the director of TOLONews TV, Afghanistan's first 24/7 news channel and the country's most popular private TV network. Lotfullah, as mentioned, is also known at the University of Chicago as a Pritzker Fellow at the Institute of Politics, where he holds seminars every Wednesday and office hours on Mondays and Wednesdays. His numerous accolades include a Time magazine profile as a next-generation global leader and Forbes 30 Under 30 Asian influencers in media. Lotfullah has interviewed dozens of global leaders, including Afghani President Ashraf Ghani, Pakistan's foreign minister, and most recently, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Also joining us tonight is David Sanger, the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. Sanger has worked on 3 teams that have won Pulitzers and has reported from New York, D.C., and Tokyo, specializing in foreign policy, national security, and the politics of globalization. Sanger's most recent book, The Perfect Weapon: War, Sabotage, and Fear in the Cyber Age, focuses on the changing nature of global power, which is relevant to tonight's talk. This evening, our guests will discuss events in Afghanistan from 9/11 to present day. The discussion will be moderated by David Axelrod, the founding director of the Institute of Politics and a senior political commentator for CNN. Drawing on their media backgrounds and Lotfullah's experiences over the past 20 years in Afghanistan, they will answer questions about the rise of a free press in Afghanistan, why the Taliban takeover was so swift, and the U.S. dilemma as it considers how to fight terrorist groups in the region without recognizing the Taliban as an equal partner. Additionally, the conversation will address the question of what does America's withdrawal from Afghanistan mean for U.S. foreign policy priorities moving forward. Thank you, and please enjoy tonight's talk.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to this beautiful place. I'm going to say something now that I suspect will meet with great approval, which is I'm going to speak very little tonight because we have 2 really distinguished journalists here who can give us, I think, a perspective from 2 different vantage points of the events that led to our withdrawal from Afghanistan and what the implications are of it. And to begin, Lotfullah, let me just ask you to talk a little bit about yourself and your own experience and what led you to this moment, just so that people understand what your vantage point has been.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you, David. And I'm very happy to be in Chicago. I was just told that the weather is going to get warmer. So it's a great program, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm very excited for the events lined up in the next few weeks. I left Kabul one day before the fall of Kabul, not because I knew, but I was traveling for work, and I've been on the road since then. And I can't expect anything better than landing in Chicago and doing this great work. But I've been a journalist for the past 15, 16 years. For the past decade or more, 11 years, I've been with TOLONews. As Astrid said, it's a TV channel based in Kabul, but with offices throughout the country and the region. We produce, even now, more than 30 news stories a day, 18 hours of content a day, interviewing, I think, around 3,000 people every month. So that gives a lot of Afghans an opportunity to speak their minds. Someone told me that one of the reasons that Afghanistan didn't have revolution in the past 20 years was because of media. The media was giving Afghans enough space to engage and express their views. So things have changed quite significantly, unfortunately, on August 15 and onwards. I was just reading a report today that in the past 2 weeks, there were, I think, 30 plus very grave human rights violations in the country. Very shocking incidents. So that's where I come from, and I think the question that why the country ended up where it is right now is probably the most pressing, which is part of the fellowship. It gives me an opportunity to think about that question and reflect that in my engagement with the students and colleagues at the IOP.
David, why don't you talk about the decision-making process that you witnessed on Afghanistan? And David and I saw a lot of each other when I was in the Obama administration, so he's covered this saga from the beginning. But the events leading up to August 15th, the major points of departure, and then I'd love to hear, Lotfullah, your sensibility from the ground of what you were experiencing there and how you saw these decisions impact on events on the ground.
Well, first, David, it's great to be back here with you, with Lotfullah, and in this beautiful space, which I'm told we're the first ones to run any kind of an event here. So it's a great honor to be back in Chicago. And it's great to see you on something other than the other end of the tube on CNN.
Yes.
Where sometimes we're contributors opposite each other, but rarely have a moment together. So when you said I covered this in the beginning, I really wasn't at the beginning, because I was in the schoolhouse with George W. Bush on the morning of 9/11. And I was White House correspondent at the time, covering the Bush administration, and sort of saw his presidency change in front of his eyes. In fact, I had wandered away from where he was speaking in the classroom and went into a small classroom where a number of the networks had set up their equipment, and saw the second plane hit the tower. And I remember there was one other correspondent there, Ed Chen, who you probably remember from the LA Times.
From the LA.
And Ed and I looked at each other across the room, and we both said, Bin Laden. And people looked at us like, who? Which sort of tells you how tuned out Americans were, at the time to what was going on. And I was in for the decision to go into Afghanistan, which I think almost any American president would have made. And then for the president's decisions after they failed to get bin Laden in Tora Bora to sort of expand the nature of what the war was about. And so while it began as a war about ousting al-Qaeda, which I think was what General Powell at the time, or then Secretary of State Powell, would have said was a understandable, narrow objective, it expanded to turning Afghanistan into a model democracy in South Asia. Then it expanded to making sure that women and girls could go to school, which was a wonderful thing, but wasn't an immediate military objective, and was not necessarily an objective the military is the best one to go do. Then it became, over the years as I covered them, bringing justice systems, bringing market economics, and so forth. So over time, it became the full-fledged American occupation, similar to the occupation in Japan, in Korea, in Germany. And I think all of these analogies kind of misled successive administrations about what they could go do. And by the time David and I intersected when he was at the White House, you'll remember, David, that there was a series of meetings, I think it began in early 2009, that President Obama called to basically reset where we were in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and to ask the question, how long do we want to be there? And by that point, we had already been there 8 years. And to try to narrow the objectives, you'll remember the president's long history here, but David can give it to you blow by blow, decided to basically surge forces briefly, the way we did in Iraq. In fact, he called on David Petraeus, who had designed that, to sort of help him think about the comparisons, and then to turn it over to the Afghan military. And David, you may remember, because I think it caused you guys a little bit of painful conversations between us. Not that we've ever had any truly painful conversations.
I've had worse.
When we when we had the leaked memo from the then American ambassador to Afghanistan, a former military commander, who basically said in it, though he worded it a little more gently, but only slightly more gently, "Dear President Obama, if you think that you can surge these forces and then train up the Afghan military to go do what you're doing and turn it all over to them and count on President Karzai at the time to do this, you never stopped smoking whatever you were smoking, you know?"
I don't think the memo said that.
But it was pretty close. That was sort of the implication. This is not going to work, right? And I think in a few years, you know, the Obama administration put together a very small group called the Afghan Good Enough Committee that was basically run by Dennis McDonough, now the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, which was basically to say, what's the minimum we can do in Afghanistan to get by? Which then became, over time, the policy of the Trump administration, which never wanted to think about Afghanistan except the year before, an election year in February, when just before COVID, they signed the agreement, Tala can talk to you about, that basically called for the Taliban over time to hold a separate set of negotiations with the Afghan government, which they never did.
Can I just interrupt you for a second? I want to pick up your narrative, but I want to ask Lotfullah how you experienced those. You obviously are younger. You were coming of age when this all started beginning, but how did you observe those years in terms of progress or lack of progress in Afghanistan? How did life change in Afghanistan during that period? David mentions women going to school, for example.
Right. I think the 5 years of Taliban rule, 96 to 2001, was probably the darkest period in our history that one can remember. They even hanged television sets. They could not even get over with the idea of a household owning a television set. Forget about your freedom to express your views, to engage. Forget about girls' education. I know a lot of people, including family members, who missed going to school in those years. So fast forward to 2001, we felt that Afghanistan was liberated. and all of a sudden the society was free. There were more cars in the streets. There were more traffic. There were more, I think, engagement in the society. There were more travels between one city to another. I think in the initial years, 2001 to 2003, I think the country made quite significant progress. We followed on politically on what is called the Bonn process. So in 2001, in December 2001, the international community gathered in Germany, in Bonn, Germany, and they laid out a roadmap for Afghanistan, starting with an interim administration to transitional administration, drafting a constitution, and then presidential election and parliamentary elections, ending in 2005. So we completed that transformation in 4 years. And that was a huge success for the country. But at the same time, I think the shift to Iraq, ignoring the Taliban, were thinking about regrouping in the neighborhood just across the border in Pakistan. I think we paid the price later, in the years later. And then that's when I think the U.S. administrations here, they started thinking about applying different policies. So from nation building to counterterrorism to a lighter footprint or more troops. One commander coming, spending his own first 100 days and then drafting a policy. New ambassador comes in, and the ambassador has his own policy. And then I think new people in DC, in the White House, as well as in the Pentagon and the State Department, they have their own sort of Afghanistan policy. So Afghanistan was this lab where one could experiment their counterinsurgency doctrine, counterterrorism, the strategies, nation building. I think that resulted into the U.S. not having one 20-year-long strategy, but 21-year-long strategies. But at the same time, you didn't have, as David said, not the right partners on the ground. President Karzai was lobbying for America's withdrawal while being the sitting president of the country. I think it was a combination of mistakes. But going back to the early years, as Afghans, we thought that we were giving this enormous chance as a society, which I think we've come a long way, but at the same time, I think the ending was so terrible.
Well, let's talk about the ending. You mentioned, David, that President Trump signed a treaty, and it was for the withdrawal by, I guess, April, right? Was the original.
Right. 14.
When you heard that, what was your reaction to that news?
In 20 years, 2001 to 2021, the Taliban could take only 20 plus districts out of 400 districts that we have. And then in the early months of 2021, the Taliban managed to take more territory. They were so confident. Engaging with the Taliban in 2019 and then in 2020 in Doha, they were telling people like me that, we only talk to you because the Americans want us to talk to you. So it's just a formality. And that resulted, that I think confidence on the Taliban side and the lack of confidence on the Republic side, that resulted into loss of territory so fast. So we lost, I think, 200 plus districts from somewhere in January, February to late July. I think the first city which fell was on August 1st. And then the last city fell on August 15th. So it was such a fast pace.
I want to come back to this because we'll come back to the impact of that. But David, talk about the timeline, the Biden decision-making timeline, and particularly the exchange you had with him
in early July.
Yeah.
So, first of all, nobody who had sat through those debates that you were in, David, had any doubt where Joe Biden felt about this. During that whole debate time, he took the position that the United States was not making a significant difference in the outcome in Afghanistan. You'll remember that at the moment that Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates were looking for 50, 60, 70,000 troops, so that Secretary Clinton wanted to be able to protect the nation-building diplomats and other workers, AID workers, that Vice President Biden's position was, this is never going to work, let's get down to 10,000 troops. Okay? So he arrives as president, he lost that decision. When you get elected president, you're suddenly the last word. I don't think any of us had any doubt where he was going to come out. The only question was, how was he going to go do it? And so he ordered a review, and on April 15th, he made the decision, or announced the decision, that the United States would leave by September 11th, obviously picked for the symbolism of the day. That meant that he was keeping American troops longer than was in the Trump agreement. But the Trump agreement was deeply flawed because it didn't require the Taliban to do anything for the U.S. to leave. And so the Taliban read that agreement and said, we can just keep taking that territory that you were just describing, and the Americans will leave anyway. And what they said to the Biden administration is, we will not attack Americans up until that date that you are committed to leaving. And after that, you really don't want to be here. And Biden believed that because we had 2,500 troops, and he knew that if the Taliban actually began attacking the American embassy, the troop emplacements there and so forth, that he would have to send more people, thousands more, to protect that group on the ground. So his view was this was unsustainable. So on April 15th, he announced we're going to begin to get out. And then the military presented him with a series of options about how to do that. And to the military, ask anybody who's gone through this, the most dangerous time in a military operation like this is when you are leaving, because the chances that you will be killed on the way out are pretty high. Something would go wrong. And so they decided to get out of the Bagram Air Base early. And of course, Bagram was where a good number of the American forces were located. And they did that on the night of July 1st. They left so quickly that, if I recall this right, they never told their Afghan partners.
Right.
Right? They just picked up, the Afghans looked around in the morning and like all the Americans were gone. There were pictures of them going through, finding old boxes of Cheerios, left over in the barracks. And it turned out that that next morning, July 2nd, the president had decided to come out into the old executive office building to celebrate some very good job creation numbers that had just been announced. And I happened to be in the pool that day. I've gone back into White House reporting for a little bit. And he called on me, and I said, your troops just left Bagram last night. That's the last big defense, because it's north of Kabul, for Kabul, as the Taliban were spreading and taking over more of the country. What is your plan B? And you go back to the transcript of this, because he answered this question for me and then for other reporters and then the next week, and he said three things. First, Kabul's not going to fall. Second, we will have an over-the-horizon capability, meaning outside the country that could come in, if we need to. And third, this has got to be the responsibility of the Afghan military, and we're there in support of them. And the only problem with that is that all three comments turned out not to be right.
Well, let me then ask you, Lotfullah, how you react to what David said. You must have been aware of what the president was saying. What were you observing on the ground? First of all, what was your reaction when there was this exodus from Bagram, and
Sure. I think Bagram was this symbol of American presence in the country. And when Bagram was abandoned, in a way that the Afghan army spent a few hours figuring out how to turn on the lights, because it was turned off via remote control. The vehicles that took the last U.S. troops to tarmac were still running. So they left the vehicles there and then got on the plane and left. I think what they had told the Afghan government, which I found out later, was that they were transferring Bagram on July 8th. So that was even before 4th of July. I think for a lot of people, that was the end of U.S. presence in the country, and the way they did it. So you could simply come to the conclusion that you cannot rely on partners like this, and who cannot even tell you when they're going to leave your house. They left without basically saying goodbye. The rest was, I agree with David that Biden's policy was clear from day one. He wanted to leave Afghanistan. I think Afghans knew that this was going to be his decision anyway. The question was, I think, on timing. He didn't stick to the May timeline that Trump made an agreement with the Taliban the year before, so he extended that. But why he just extended that, to September 11th? And then he said no conditions, so no matter what. And then I think that was when the Taliban, I believe, said, okay, then why should we talk about the political process? The Americans are leaving, the army is going to collapse, and then we're just going to take over militarily. So that's what we have right now.
now were you, at what point did you recognize that was the sequence of events, were you surprised at the speed with which the country collapsed, that the military abandoned the fight and the government fled?
I think, yes. I think a lot of, some of us were, and depending on who predicted what date. But starting with the peace negotiations in 2018, ignoring the Afghan government, ignoring so many other leaders and realities inside Afghanistan, that was the beginning of the end for Afghanistan of 2001 to 2021. And then with the deal which was announced in February 2020, that gave the Taliban. So the Taliban were so happy that they made a deal with the U.S. And then the rest were irrelevant, I think, for them.
But in that period from say July 2nd through August 15th, did you? At what point did you say this whole thing is going to come down, and it's going to come down quickly?
I think when all big cities like Kandahar didn't fight, Jalalabad didn't fight, Mazar didn't fight, Kabul didn't fight, Herat fought a little bit because of the warlord, the anti-Taliban warlord.
And why do you think they didn't? See, that was a key intelligence failure of the U.S. They underestimated the power of the Taliban, but they wildly overestimated the willingness to fight.
Right.
Do you think if the United States had stayed, they would have been more willing, or you think they would have fallen apart anyway?
Right. I think we're doing a seminar on this, that why they didn't fight. But I believe a lot of Afghan soldiers just thought this was a lost cause. They didn't believe in their own government, most importantly, which turned out to be true. The president of the country so cowardly fled, a few hours before the fall of Kabul, and also because they thought the U.S. was no longer there. I think also the leadership of ANDSF in the past couple of years, one should look into it. For instance, just one example, we didn't have a Minister of Defense for 6 months. And he was not fired, so he was on medical leave, and because General Miller liked him, so Ghani couldn't fire him, and then Ghani wanted to keep him, and then somebody else wanted him out. So a lot of these details really contributed to I think why the army and the police didn't fight. Also pay issue, also ethnic issues. I'm not sure if Ghani really was the commander-in-chief who could communicate with his forces. And we never had 350,000 troops, which we claim that we had on paper. A lot of ghost soldiers, a lot of corruption in the army. I know people who were posted, let's say, in Helmand for years, and they were never given a break. So I think that's why a lot of people just gave up. And there was this. And the Taliban were so good in their communications, which we're going to do another seminar, Astrid, right, on Taliban's communication doctrine, that they basically took over military bases with Twitter and Facebook messages.
They were they did a huge Twitter campaign, which I think we weren't really noticing that much here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That I guess people were reading. They seemed to have millions of readers in.
Right. And they thought this was a deal that involved America, Taliban, the region. So why should you just lose your life for something, that you can't sort of change it?
So I want to ask you a question, then I want to ask David about the sort of policy implications of all this. But you described the progress that took place after 2001. In a sense, TOLONews is a reflection of that progress. You're an independent news organization,
right.
But there are all kinds of other manifestations of that. What is the realization of what was the realization of people about what this meant, what it meant, and then briefly describe conditions in Afghanistan today?
Right now, it's very bleak. We are having an economic crisis. Winter is coming. I think people are having a hard time finding food. I was in DC a couple of days ago and talking to people in your government, and they were so clear that we don't want $1 to go to the Taliban. So the question is, how are we going to pledge money for humanitarian purposes without money going to the Taliban? I think this is a question for so many of the countries in the West. And some of the NGOs are there, but that's nowhere to where it was just 2-3 months ago. Mm-hmm. The Taliban today celebrated, I think, $1 million investment or support from China, compared to $5 billion coming from the U.S. And that's where we are. So that's on the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding. We're not even touching the question of terrorism.
Yeah, well, let's touch on that question. Let's touch on that, David. I mean, there is a sense of relief, I'm sure, on the part of many Americans to be disentangled, to leave Afghanistan. The question is, does Afghanistan leave us? And what are the implications of? I mean, what we've had discussions, and what you just described, Lotfullah, and what you read is the real danger of a potential failed state. And we saw a report today of a government official here saying within 6 months or a year, we're going to be looking at potential staging of terrorist acts against the U.S. again. What are the strategic implications for the U.S.?
So a few calculations that go into this. Just came from a conference over the weekend that the head of the National Counterterrorism Center was at, and we were asking her a lot of these same questions. And at this point, they just don't know. President Biden was accurate when he said, look, you can't design your counterterrorism strategy to reflect the conditions of 2001. Terrorists organize in a lot of failed states and an open space around the world right now. Most of the terrorism we've seen come together, Al-Shabaab, many others, have been coming together in Africa. We've got other failed states we're worrying about right now, Yemen, Sudan, where there is a coup underway. Certainly we're concerned about Libya. So if there's a strike on the United States, it doesn't necessarily need to come out of Afghanistan. There are lots of places for terrorists to live. That said, if it does formulate in Afghanistan, then the president's going to be back answering the question, why did you leave and create the space where this could happen? And, you know, the true answer is that Republicans applauded this when President Trump said we were leaving and didn't ask that question. But right now there's a Democrat in the White House, and so they're all, you know, taking a different position, as is President Trump, who, by the way, said on Twitter in the midst of this is a disaster. I never would have left until I got back out every loyal person to the United States in Afghanistan. And you may recall that he tweeted out around December 15th, everybody, all the American forces will be out by Christmas, 10 days. To which the chairman of the Joint Chiefs had to say, sorry, we can't do that. So we're in a situation now where I think it's entirely possible that you could get a terror attack building up. If I was a terrorist, I wouldn't do it from Afghanistan. But this is going to be the test of how much of our intelligence assets we have lost by losing having an embassy, a CIA station, lots of other outposts, and lots of allies with eyes on all of this. Because you can't do all of this from the air. Look at that horror that we had in the last days where we followed somebody from a drone, thought he was gathering explosives to bring to the gate, and thanks to a New York Times investigation that reconstituted film on the ground, it turned out he was collecting water for his family. And you know, he got blown up, and a lot of kids did as well. That gives you a sense of how hard it is to collect accurate intelligence.
Well, you were saying that you were privy to the sort of before and after of their over-the-horizon capacities and how diminished this idea that you can survey the country with drones and keep tabs on what's going on there.
I think when the Americans, you know, lost some of these on-the-ground capabilities, so they heavily relied on drones. And in the last months or weeks, from what I know, that there were only one drone flying from Doha, 4 hours, coming into Afghanistan for another 4 hours. And then, because the drone, you know, can be in the air, I think, for 12 hours, so another 4 hours to go back. And then another drone was taking over for another 4 hours. I don't know how much you can really see and record. So I'm not sure if the United States has any capabilities right now to make any sound intelligence assessment on what's happening. Particularly not only in Afghanistan but also in the border area of Pakistan, where you have all these terrorists. I think at some point there were 20 plus terrorist organizations inside Afghanistan. So you have enemies of literally all countries. So this is haven for haters of so many countries. from the U.S. to China, to all Central Asian countries, and also Pakistan. You know, there are like TTP, for instance. So I think you have given, and especially now that the Interior Minister of Afghanistan, who is in charge of security to make sure that these people don't operate, is a terrorist based on your law. He has a $10 million bounty on his head. And he is in charge of Kabul, and he is gaining more control over the state of affairs in Afghanistan. And those people who negotiated whatever deal in Doha are very much irrelevant right now, including people like Mullah Baradar and others. So you have this ungoverned space, and then you have people who are, I'm not sure, very committed to counterterrorism assurances that the U.S. government is talking about. I hope nothing happens to any country, to Afghan, to the U.S., and to any of our neighbors. But the question is, we really don't know.
And what about this and I'll ask this of both of you, but what are the implications of the humanitarian disaster there in terms of the instability of the political situation there, and in terms of a potential refugee crisis?
Right. So right now, Afghanistan is this prison. No country is allowing people to travel. Our borders with Pakistan is closed, with Iran is closed, with Central Asia is closed. There are, some people with special arrangements, who can travel. So millions of Afghans who might need to travel for medical and other, purposes, they're not allowed to leave. And then I think the crisis will ultimately, I believe, contribute to some sort of, domestic unrest and potential civil war. So in my view, it's a lose-lose situation. We're either going to end up in a civil war situation, or Afghanistan is going to become ruled by a government or a regime sponsoring and supporting terrorist organizations.
And I must ask you, do you anticipate being able to go back to Afghanistan?
Well, right now there are no flights, so technically no. But when there are flights, I should be able to go back. I'm not sure if I will be able to do my job. I'm not sure if the Taliban would be happy for somebody like me to sit down and question them on television. I'm not sure if they would let me leave. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But I at least talk to them every now and then, and I think they are trying to portray this image that by return of so many Afghans, they can show to the world that it's a normal country, which is not.
David, the president described strategic objectives for moving on from Afghanistan and why it was important to move on from Afghanistan. Talk about that and those objectives.
Sure. So when you talk to this administration about what are their big national security objectives, it's dealing with China, and it's dealing with China.
It's easy to remember, at least.
It is easy to remember. And you can understand why that is the case, because with the exception of one thing we've discussed today, which is the concern about terrorism that could strike back at the homeland, the 9/11 concept, we now face a true strategic peer competitor who is an economic competitor, a military competitor, and a technology competitor. And tragic as what we are seeing go on in Afghanistan is, and I've covered this on and off from afar, not the way Lotfullah has, for 20 years, as a matter of pure national interest, much more of our future is tied up in Asia and in managing China and keeping this from spinning into a Cold War, something I wrote about last week, than any of our interests in Afghanistan. That isn't to suggest for a minute that the fate of the Afghans under the Taliban isn't a huge humanitarian problem and that we have a huge moral responsibility for it. But as a matter of national interest, China trumps all. And when the president talked about why he wanted to get out, he was very clear. He said, I need more resources on China and I need more resources on cyber, something I've spent a lot of my time writing and reporting about over the past more than a dozen years, because cyber has moved to be the centerpiece of how the world is trying to undercut American power without going to war directly. They've seen the results of war. Nothing would have made the Chinese happier, Biden says, and he's right, than to see us stay in Afghanistan and to tie up resources. And that while the resources themselves weren't all that great, the mind share that comes from having all of those Americans there and the worry about them every day, think about what happened with the tragedy with, 13 Americans killed on the way out, tends to dominate all. So the big question is, in his bet, will Americans forget the messiness of how we got out? And he argues there was no neat way to get out of Afghanistan. We'll only remember that we got out and then be able to go focus on what we need to do as a nation, rebuilding our democracy at home, industrial policy, rebuilding a semiconductor capability, competing in artificial intelligence and quantum and long battery life, battery technologies, autonomous vehicles, the things we need to do to compete with China, and to move our military resources to make sure that Taiwan is safe, that China doesn't expand beyond the South China Sea, and so forth. And that's where their heads are. And I don't blame them for thinking that way, because that's what more of America's future is tied up in.
Well, if the additional 2,500 troops can deliver all of that, why not?
That's right. So you raise a really interesting point, and I've made this point to them. There's nothing we were doing in Afghanistan that would prevent us from doing all the things, the people who need to work on building semiconductor capability in the United States are not the same people who need to worry about how we handle the Afghan problem. But it is a mind share issue, and it is an issue of getting Americans focused away from the wars that dominated the past 20 years and think about the next 50.
Right.
We're going to take some questions, so if you want to, I think there's going to be a microphone somewhere. Oh, it's right over there. So if you have a question, head up to that microphone over there. While people are contemplating that, let me ask you about two issues related to China that are, one is the testing of these hypersonic missiles, and the other is Taiwan, which seem like two very significant
big issues
on the horizon here.
So, hypersonics are sort of an interesting issue because during the 20 years that we were in Afghanistan and Iraq, a whole generation came up through the University of Chicago and every other distinguished institution here, not having to think about nuclear weapons and nuclear competition. And why are hypersonics important? Not because of their speed, an ICBM launched out of Russia or China moves faster, but because of their maneuverability and the difficulty in detecting them. A normal missile that we're accustomed to from the nuclear age does a nice, clean parabola, and when you're designing missile defenses, when you see it launch, you can figure out exactly where you're going to go intercept it. We've spent $400 billion designing missile defenses over the past 30 years, which isn't quite as much as we spent in Afghanistan, but close. And what hypersonics do is render it all relatively useless, because our systems are not designed to handle a missile that is suborbital and can go in a very unpredictable path. Taiwan is a problem because we are not committed by treaty to go defend it. We've had a position of strategic ambiguity, which means...
The president wasn't very ambiguous last week when he
certainly wasn't. And I'm not sure if you saw this, David, but I wrote about it over the weekend. 20 years ago, George W. Bush was not very ambiguous about Taiwan. He said, we will do whatever it takes to defend them. And someone wrote a really well-argued op-ed in the Washington Post a few days later saying words matter in something like this, and we need to maintain our position of ambiguity so that the Chinese aren't entirely sure how we would respond, and that Taiwan doesn't believe that we will necessarily come to their defense.
I feel the punchline coming here. And
Yeah.
the author was?
Joe Biden.
Right.
Yeah. Worth Googling. I quoted it at length in the Times this week. And he basically made the same.
Tony Blinken probably wrote that piece.
He probably had, yeah. I didn't ask him, but I will. He made essentially the same mistake. And the reason that he did so is that we're in this odd cycle right now, David, where we're all engaging in Cold War-like behavior, threatening each other on territory, disentangling our economies. In the Cold War, we did spy swaps. This time we swap Huawei executives. And a Chinese buildup of their nuclear weapons because they think they're going to get sucked into arms control agreements with us, and they want to start with as many chips on the table as we and the Russians have. And the problem with this is that if you approach China as a Cold War issue, first, it's radically different than the problem we had with the Soviet Union, where we didn't have any economic interdependence. But second, when you begin to see every little development as part of a bigger Cold War, you make different kinds of decisions. It's how we got into Vietnam, right? We thought it was an extension of the communist effort to take over in Europe. And that was domino theory, right? And we're right at the cusp right now because the politics in both Washington and in Beijing push both sides, Democrats and Republicans, to sort of go to the far right and say we're going to draw a line here.
Yeah. We should point out, let's get a questioner up here. We should point out that one of the bills that has languished in Congress is the much heralded, or two versions of a China competitiveness package.
Right. It's passed in the Senate, and it has the remarkable thing, David, that it was the only bill I've seen this year that actually passed with a significant bipartisan majority. There were 66 or 67 votes in total. Name me any other bill you've seen where, 17 Republicans signed on. And it would provide $50 billion for the semiconductor industry in the United States, which when David and I were just a few years younger, we used to call industrial policy.
Yeah.
Right. So far, it has not moved in the House. It will, but I think what's going on is that Nancy Pelosi, understandably, does not want to add another $1 trillion to everything else she's trying to get through right now.
Yeah, understandably, indeed. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jane. I'm a graduate student at the university. We've been talking about this in my course, and I've been looking into it with the negotiation process that essentially never really manifested into something that would have been beneficial to the people in Afghanistan, as well as U.S. interests. But here we are, and we're in this state where we don't have any intelligence in Afghanistan, and now there's this regime that wants to be seen as legitimate. At this point, considering the humanitarian crisis and moral obligations to help the people of Afghanistan, do you think that the U.S. should begin talks and recognizing, despite the history with the Taliban, them as a legitimate regime in order to aid and in order to help our advantage in this whole geopolitical sphere?
I don't think so. I don't think the U.S. should recognize the Taliban. But it doesn't mean that the U.S. cannot talk to the Taliban. I think the U.S. was the first who started talking to the Taliban. So that channel is there. There were talks in Doha a couple of weeks ago. I think Deputy CIA Director went there, and they talked about some of these issues, primarily, I think, counterterrorism. But I think the question of how the U.S. should help the Afghan people, I think that that needs to be sorted out from what I gather. I don't think that the long-term relationship or the next chapter of the relationship is really processed in DC. The Afghanistan envoy just quit a couple of days ago, and his argument is that there isn't much for him to do, basically. So I'm not sure if the United States will find a way where they can have a normal relations with the Taliban anytime soon. I don't think that there is any interest to recognize or acknowledge the fact that there is a government in Kabul that can serve U.S. interests.
Do you feel, and do the Afghan people feel, that the U.S. has an obligation to?
I think so. I'm probably one of those Afghans who, doesn't want to blame everything on the U.S. The list of our shortcomings is much, much longer than yours. But it doesn't mean that you have. You had a horse in the race. You are part of what we have inherited today. And this is not the first time. I think after Cold War, the same happened. U.S. abandoned, and years later, 9/11 happened. So I'm not saying it's going to happen again. I'm not saying just this might be sort of same movie, but I think there is a moral obligation as well as I believe there is a national security obligation as well. Look at all these Afghans who are left behind, the ones who have worked immediately and directly for the U.S. government. I'm not even talking about journalists and other Afghans at risk. I'm talking about those who have served America and the U.S. government. I don't think that you were able to bring most of them back to the U.S. There are efforts to do that. I'm not sure if that's going to happen in a short amount of time.
David, Lotfullah has raised one of the great what-ifs of the first year of the Biden administration. So Biden makes his decision on April 15th to get out. And, I think what you've heard from up here is perfectly reasonable decision after 20 years to make the case that we're not going to accomplish much more in 2 years or 5 years than we, if you try to win this ball game for 20 years and you don't succeed, maybe you're, ought to be thinking of something else. That said, the what if is, at the moment that he made that decision, did the United States need to put in place a plan that every person who reasonably might be given a special immigrant visa to the United States, people who helped the military, people who helped intelligence agencies, journalists, people who helped the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others, who would be at risk in the country, whether the Taliban had taken Kabul or had just taken the 2/3 of the country they held before Kabul, whether they all needed to get out of the country before the last American military force left in what was supposed to be September 11th. And clearly, in retrospect, if they had that one to play over again, they would do it quite differently. Mm-hmm. They won't admit to that at this point. It's a difficult thing, too. And what they all say is, had we done an airlift of that many people, it would have so undercut the Afghan government that it would have triggered the collapse of the government. We'll never know if that's the case.
I think they also say the government asked them not to do that.
Government did. On his last visit to Washington, Ashraf Ghani said that quite explicitly to the president.
I'm of the mind that sometimes it is better politically to acknowledge mistakes than to deny them when the mistakes are obvious. And I think this was one of those cases. I think Biden got less credit, at least in the short run, for the decision he made because of how he described our exit from Afghanistan in ways that completely defied people's.
You're watching the chaos.
Yeah,
on your
it just
play out.
so. But anyway, we have another question over here from a member of the. Oh, that's the University of Chicago sweatshirt. I thought you were on the Bears.
Hi, I'm Sanjay. I'm a first year studying economics at the university. So my question was about the region near Afghanistan. So the nations of Pakistan, India, especially Kashmir, and the former Soviet states in the region. So now that Afghanistan has fallen, what will the reverberations be? Like, will these nations and regions be destabilized? Should nations like Pakistan expect to potentially have the Taliban retake parts of the country? Yeah, that's my question.
Could you go first? And
I think yes. I think it's going to have an implication. The consequences is going to be quite obvious. That it's not as pleasant as the region might like. You mentioned Pakistan, India. I would like to talk about Iran. So Iran wanted to see the U.S. leaving with a bloody nose, right? So they favored Taliban and they worked with the Taliban and they funded the Taliban, and now they don't like it. They don't like what they've wished for. Look at ISIS, killing Shias in Afghanistan. I think most of the countries in the neighborhood didn't believe that the U.S. was leaving. So the U.S. was basically fighting with the help, of course, together with the Afghan forces, for the entire region, security as well. So that's gone. I think India should be very concerned. Iran is concerned. Central Asia is gravely concerned. China is concerned. The Taliban are trying to be closer to China, so they're arresting all these, Uyghur fighters and handing them over to the Chinese government. This is, in general, a victory message to all terrorist and jihadi organizations around the world, that you can defeat America, you can defeat anything, right? So there is this great, aspiration for so many of groups like the Taliban in the region and outside, who might give it a try and see what will happen.
David, my biggest concern isn't really reconstituting terrorists within Afghanistan, although that could be a big issue, and particularly if ISIS was able to come back together, or al-Qaeda spin-offs. My biggest concern has always been inside Pakistan. And that's because Pakistan has something that no one else in the region other than India has, which is 80 to 100 nuclear weapons sitting right there. And we were deeply concerned about that in the years after 9/11, when the question was, what happens if, because of an insider, basically one of those weapons or two of those weapons goes loose? And you may remember that in the opening days of the Obama administration, there was huge concern about this, especially during 2 weeks when they thought that one of the weapons, or one or more of the weapons, was unaccounted for, and President Obama discovered we did not have a ready-go force to go seek it out. And I think you were probably still in the White House during that time. This was a big, dramatic issue. I played out in a book called Confront and Conceal about the Obama first term. And what concerns me is the Pakistani arsenal in the interim time has roughly doubled in size. And our understanding of how well that is protected has not doubled in size.
On that cheerful note, let's take the next question.
Hi, my name's Adam. I'm a fourth-year neuroscience major. I'm from Iowa City, Iowa. My parents are from Venezuela, and I feel like when I talk to my family there about the situation there, the first thing they're always saying in terms of organizing and how to overthrow the government is, why won't the U.S. get involved? And I think that's true all over the world. And I'm wondering if, in the aftermath of Afghanistan, that type of thinking will change both outside of the U.S. and in the U.S.
This came up repeatedly during the Trump administration, when President Trump would press his intelligence and military advisors to, why don't we just go in and knock off Maduro, right? And why do I have to put up with this stuff? There were a few adjectives put in there along the way. And especially because Venezuela has oil, and you know how that fixated Donald Trump's mind, right? Take the oil, that'll pay for the whole thing. What we discovered in Afghanistan was, when you go into a country, even with a small CIA force, as we did in the early days in Afghanistan, but then later on, you not only own the country, you own every problem in the country. And we then spent 20 years trying to solve every problem in the country, and then we left. And the warning he kept getting, and Joe Biden, I think, knows in his bones, is the problem isn't knocking off Maduro. That would probably take a few days to a week. It's everything that follows. And you end up owning the country and trying to rebuild the democracy, and then having to get into the midst of every bit of fractured politics. And I think if there is one thing that's clear about President Biden is in leaving Afghanistan and reducing our forces in Iraq, he does not plan to own problems like that. And most Americans don't want to own problems like this. The cycle of American history, though, is just as David was describing it before, which is we get this sort of isolationist view that we're just going to deal with problems on our own borders, and certainly we have plenty of those, right? And then something happens to us from afar that ends up killing Americans here at home or changing our way of life. And then we move from ignoring the problem to overreacting and over-assuming what it is we can do about it. And we've been through that cycle a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Christy. I'm a senior at the college. My question, so you mentioned the U.S. strategic priority right now is China, China, China. So I was wondering, going back to terrorism, how concerned is the administration about terrorism or having like another attack on U.S. soil?
I think they're, quite concerned about it. It's a different set, it requires a different set of talents than dealing with China does. Dealing with China is real three-level chess, right? You can't bar Huawei, and today, thanks to a ruling from the Federal Communications Commission, China Mobile got thrown out of the country without giving the world an alternative. We didn't have something to sell to people other than Huawei. You can't say that we're going to cut ourselves off from Chinese semiconductors if it turns out those semiconductors power your cars and your toaster ovens, and you've got more supply chain problems of the kind we've seen. You can't say that we are going to commit more military forces there throughout the Pacific if you have them tied up elsewhere around the world. There's a reason that Lotfullah only saw one drone flying over there. We have a limited number of drones and, a lot of spots from North Korea to Libya to Iran to go put them over. And so we are, despite the fact that we're the biggest military in the world, living in a world of scarce resources. And so then you're just trying to manage risk. And the question is, how much resource do you have to put to countering terrorism to reduce that risk? You're not going to take it to zero. And how will that bet look 5 or 10 years from now?
I want to ask a couple of questions as we go out. You've talked, Lotfullah, about the sense of unreliability that people feel about the U.S. in Afghanistan and perhaps in the region because of the way this whole thing unraveled. David, I want to ask you, what was the damage to America? We saw Joe Biden arrive on the global scene and announce that America was back. We had allies in Afghanistan. We weren't the only ones there. We had NATO allies in Afghanistan. What, if anything, was the damage from Afghanistan, and has it been repaired? And does it color in any way his trip now to
Europe this week?
To Europe around climate and where he'll be making commitments?
I think it did. Look, if you think of this administration in seasons, the winter where he was inaugurated was consumed by getting the country vaccinated, a work in progress. but getting the virus under control. And rebuilding alliances, how many times did you hear that had been very badly damaged in the Trump era? And that was a big deal because while you could say we're back and we're here to go deal with the alliances, what President Biden and Secretary Blinken and others heard so often was, yeah, you're back for 4 years. Mm-hmm. But I keep picking up the paper and seeing that Donald Trump's thinking of running again. How far out do you want me to get involved into an alliance with the United States that could be undercut again? We could re-enter the Iran deal, but if Trump or someone who sympathizes with Trump's way of thinking comes in, it's gone again. And the president was making progress on that when the chaos of Afghanistan came. And I think the damage done this summer was that it damaged a sense of great competency, that they had brought professionals in, and it's a very professional administration full of people who are seasoned and have been through all this stuff before. And the fact that the execution of a understandable and well thought out policy was so poor, I think hurt them. And then the Australian submarine deal came along. Mm-hmm. Again, strategically, the right decision. Why not bring the Australians fully on board and make the Chinese have to worry about their submarines as well as ours? But then someone forgets to tell the French, and it suddenly looks like we have undercut another one of our alliances.
Because the French had a deal with the Australians that was undercut.
The French had a deal, and the French ambassador tells me he discovered the deal was undone when on the morning that all of this was announced. That wasn't the kind of alliance management I think that the French had in mind.
Yeah, yeah. Lotfullah, on a completely different subject, I like to talk about this because I do feel like democracies everywhere are being challenged. And the essence of democracy, or part of the essence of democracy, is a free media to cover. You talk about the drones covering Afghanistan. Free media are, effectively drones covering democracy and reporting on things in dark corners that citizens need to know. You've helped establish that in Afghanistan. First of all, at what risk was that done, and how sustainable is that moving forward, given everything that you've described here? Because I know your mission has been to try and keep TOLONews running, and you've been doing it from the outside.
Right. We're the freest country when it comes to press freedom in the entire region, but at the same time, we are the deadliest country for journalists in the world. So that means journalists are paying a very high price for what they've achieved. We at TOLONews have lost 11 colleagues to 4 direct Taliban and Daesh attacks since 2016. And for a relatively small news operation, that's not a small number of people and colleagues to lose. I think we have lost over 100 journalists in the country in the past 20 years. So many others wounded. And targeted attacks started happening in the past year. So free press has a lot of enemies in countries like Afghanistan, where rule of law is not that strong. You have so many enemies, be it your own government, be it the insurgency, be it mafia, drug lords, warlords, strongmen, and your villages. People hate you for all these 30 stories that we produce every day. They make enemies, and people think that that's personal, especially when laws can't really protect you. Going forward, at this stage, it's unfortunate that broadcasting music has stopped. Soap operas are censored. Journalists cannot go after stories that they could, let's say, 2-3 months ago. Ghani had appointed an incompetent interior minister Not that that was, the only incompetent appointment by Ghani. But so we had to scrutinize his background from his time as governor of Helmand to another posting and all that. But now we have a terrorist who's our interior minister, and we can't say much about him. So that's a huge difference, which is very, very painful for somebody like me, who has been part of, the growth of it.
Have the Taliban tried to shut down, do the Chinese thing of actually interfere with the broadcast?
I think what they have done is that they have issued directives and instructions. So they would like to turn it into their favor right now because of not so much resistance from the media community. So they are saying, for instance, one of the things that they said is that don't call it the Taliban anymore, call it Islamic Emirate. And they're not even making it as a suggestion. I mean, that is an order coming from the government. And what can you say about it? But if you start, let's say, resisting that, then, who knows what's going to come next? How would you be censored? And journalists have been beaten covering protests. We showed some very troubling pictures the other day to students. I must say, the state of free media, is very, very troubling and is very, very painful to see right now.
Yeah, well, just as we leave, I want to thank you both, and I want to recognize the role of journalists. And I say that looking at David Sanger, who irritated me more than once when I was in the White House. But having been a former journalist...
Yeah, you were really crummy at sort of working up the outrage, I found, It just didn't seem genuine enough.
As a former journalist, I also always appreciated the role that you and others play in telling people what's going on in their own government, and such an essential part of democracy. So two fine examples of that, and we're really lucky to have you here tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you.